Thank you. So just a quick word about GOETEC. We're a small organisation, Kent-based, and we're jointly owned by the universities in Kent, most of the colleges in Kent, and Kent County Council, with very much a remit to facilitate shared services in Kent. What I'm going to talk about today probably complements Steve's talk quite nicely. It's about largely the Kent Public Service Network, and where Steve spends a lot of the time on layers 8 and 9 in the network stack, politics and religion, I'll focus mainly on layers 1 to 7. And some of the challenges we faced, particularly around the security model for KPSN and where we're looking to share services, how all that integrates. So this is very much from the perspective of the Kent Public Service Network, but I think some of the issues I'll talk about this afternoon will probably relate to an HE network, particularly as there's more and more bring your own device collaborations, working with external organisations that are housed within your physical campuses. So I think some of the issues we faced you may well face in microcosm, so hopefully some of this will be relevant and will be useful. Just one opening thought, something that hasn't been mentioned today is something called RENA that some of you may have heard of, and there are some very interesting papers on this, and there's a view that if you like, the internetwork layer and the design of the network was lost somewhere in the 70s, that it was proposed as the standards were being developed, but actually it went away, and the thing we call the internet is just one enormous network. Now it's kind of become an internet again thanks to firewalls and NAT and those kinds of things, so there are separate isolated networks that are all joined together in an internet. But I'd encourage you, if you're interested in this sort of thing, go away and do some background reading, because I think a lot of what I'll talk about today would actually have been easier if this model had been in place. Another thing to say is a lot of what I'll talk about today would probably have been a lot easier with software-defined networking, but unfortunately we were probably about 10 years too early. So just a little bit of background on the Kent Public Service Network. It connects around 1,300 sites across the county of Kent, and we estimate that there are around 370,000 users on a term time weekday. A lot of those are quite small users across the schools, but quite large numbers. And we've got 2 by 20 gig connectivity to Janet, and are frequently using about 6 of it now on a turn time weekday. The KPSN partnership includes schools, which is right through from primary to secondary schools and specialist sixth form colleges and other specialised schools. Local government, so the county council and all the local authorities are members, the 12 across Kent. Libraries as part of Kent County Council. Fire and rescue now connect all their sites. We also use KPSN to provide the connectivity for Janet connected sites. There's some health on board, although as you possibly imagine, the health community is quite fragmented into a number of different trusts, and different trusts are at different stages in coming on board, and there's also some connectivity for police. Something that's not mentioned up there is we've also provided, in 1 or 2 cases, connectivity to things like business parks in enterprise zones where there's been demonstrated market failure, to help get them off the ground, because there are some fairly rural bits of Kent where connectivity from commercial providers was just not feasible. So we've worked with them to get them off the ground. This is our measles map of the county, and as you can see from that, sites are very widely spread across the county. So we built a network. I haven't got pictures of it, but with I think at the last count something like 59 POPs across the county. The blue blobs are primary schools, which as you can see tend to be a lot more scattered than the other functions. So first of all, I'll talk about KPSN layer 1. The whole philosophy there is do as much sharing of physical links as possible, including to end sites. And something we've seen a lot of recently is public sector bodies sharing end sites. And most particularly, this is local government and health have shared a lot of end sites. And actually, we've saved a lot of money by just having a single fibre link, typically, or a single network link to those end sites. It also makes it much, much easier if you've got a connection to an end site. So for example, local government, and health suddenly says, we'd like to move in there. Rather than having the whole lead time of ordering another connection, waiting for that to be delivered, configured, etc., we already have a connection. It's simply a case of our service provider enabling another VRF to be delivered to that site, another port to be made live on the customer premises router. So it makes things very much quicker and easier and gives us a lot more flexibility, even in a world pre what we call SDN. But in some senses, I guess there are little bits of SDN features in there. And this sort of thing will be easier and quicker as we move into an SDN world, as I'm sure we inevitably will. The way partners' traffic is isolated is probably, as you'd expect, using MPLS. And as we've gradually integrated partners, we've found that one of the big challenges is there's an awful lot of overlapping IP address space, RFC 1918 address space, and almost everyone we've come across, I think, somewhere has a 10.1.1.1 in their network. So without the use of MPLS, frankly, I think we'd have had virtually an impossible task. MPLS is perceived as being secure enough for isolation of traffic for fairly critical services, including the likes of health and police, although we are audited from time to time, and occasionally we get headaches in relation to particularly the data centres in universities. There are lots of services provided across MPLS. The first thing I'll deal with is layer 2, which is in the minority, I should say. Most of the services are layer 3, but it is very important. One of the first things that happened is we put baby jumbo frames on the core, and don't ask me the exact figure, but something like 1548 is in my head for some reason, which means if we're using queue-in-queue or tunnel traffic, those kinds of things, end sites can use the full 1500 byte MTU. There are a lot of point-to-point pseudo wires, which customers like because they're very easy to understand. They behave an awful lot like just a straight Ethernet connection. So you can do anything you like with them, including there are still bits and pieces of netware out there. And frankly, without the point-to-point pseudo wires, I don't know how we go about supporting that across the WAN. There's also some multi-point to multi-point layer 2, but that's limited, and partly because of the complexity of supporting it, we are looking at whether we should actually get rid of that. Layer 3 connectivity, as you'd expect, lots of IPv4. That's mostly any-to-any. There are also some organisations that prefer a hub-and-spoke design. So I think fire and rescue, everything is essentially channeled through a central point in a hub-and-spoke type of arrangement. Increasingly, we're seeing bits and pieces of IPv6. So this is live, certainly very much at one of the universities on KPSN. There are also a couple of schools that have are at the stage of kind of playing with it, and it's being looked at in various other areas. So there's full support for IPv6. There's also limited support for multicast, again, mainly for Janet sites, although that's not heavily used at the moment. Steve mentioned shared services in his presentation. We also have a number of shared services across KPSN. One of the things is there are 2 major data centers on the 10 gig core of the network, and if you rent a rack in each data center, as a bonus, you get entirely free a shared 10 gig link between the 2 of them. That's sub-millisecond latency. The data centers are just under 20 kilometers apart. Or you can pay somewhere under 3,000 a year, I think it is, for a dedicated 10 gig link, which is just a lambda on the KPSN core. And that's certainly been very well received, and I'm not aware of anywhere else you can go out and buy this sort of functionality if you're looking to establish resilient services, or if you do, you tend to be paying a lot more for the connectivity between the 2 sites. So this is very well used, and I think at the last count we're up to something like 9 lambdas on that 10 gig link, with a few more queued up and likely to go ahead in the future. There's more and more line of business application sharing, and there was lots of head scratching went on in the early days of KPSN about, well, how do we actually facilitate that? And what was established is something we called an internet exchange. It's a logical concept in a couple of different locations, and the concept is that you put services in this logical area called an internet exchange, and then there are firewalls between the internet exchange and your own private networks. And the other thing is, with lots of overlapping addresses, there ends up being lots of natting going on at the boundaries of that internet exchange. But having said that, and with some of the complexity, it has been very successful. And I think the fact that KPSN partners are sitting round the table discussing the network and related services means they're quite likely to have a chat about whether they could actually share services. And we've seen more and more of that going on. Much of that has been across the local government in particular, where there are obvious synergies. Councils are relatively small in scale typically, and they see real benefits and cost savings to sharing. But there is some of this across almost all of the KPSN partners at one level or another. This is just a picture showing how some of this connects. So the blue blob in the middle is the KPSN internet exchange. It's not labelled as such there. That's where the applications sit, and that's where the sharing goes on. There are firewalls between that and the internet, and also firewalls between there and the individual partners. I should say most of the firewalls you can see on that diagram are large centralized firewalls that have been virtualized, so they're not physically separate. And the other thing that's not reflected here, this is very much a logical picture. The physical picture is this is split very much between two locations with two big firewalls and lots of virtualization going on. And if I tried to draw the physical picture as well as the logical one, it would probably get very messy and very confusing. The main services that are shared include remote access, firewalls, web filtering, email filtering, and we have got extremely good economies of scale with some of these. So a lot of the, particularly if you look at something the size of a district council or even fire and rescue, what they're paying for a real enterprise class email filtering solution is a tiny fraction of what they'd be likely to pay if they went out to the market to procure. We got an incredibly good deal on web filtering through Lightspeed systems with in the region of, I think, 120,000 licenses, and that's been of great benefit. That was based on the schools requiring Lightspeed, but that's been of great benefit, particularly to a number of the colleges and one or two of the universities who've taken advantage of that. And the cost per seat is a small fraction of what you pay if you went out to the market independently. And indeed, one of the colleges had recently procured Lightspeed and was very upset when we told them about this deal. But they've since moved and are now using the KPSN deal that's available. KPSN authentication, this is particularly around those shared service apps. There was a bit of a false start, particularly among local government, when there was an attempt to put all KPSN accounts into a single Active Directory, and you can probably imagine how well that went, or didn't go. Some of the applications, and this is something we very much try to do, are compatible with multiple Active Directory backends, so they can point at multiple separate domains and authenticate against many of those, and Lightspeed web filtering is a very good example. Unfortunately, some applications can't, so there are some messy, essentially, pulls from Active Directory from a number of different partners that get dumped onto a server in the Internet Exchange and serve as the authentication backend for some of the applications. The main disadvantage there is, well, one, if it falls over, if the upload falls over, but also particularly the fact that a new user can be added in the morning and can't use the application until the next day after the nightly upload has happened. Something I'll say a little bit more about, I'm just conscious of time, is PSN Roam. So KPSN had a number of discussions with the Cabinet Office about establishing an EduRoam-like system for most of the rest of the public sector. Ideally, we'd have had one system for everyone, but because of some of the constraints imposed by the Global EduRoam Federation, it wasn't really possible to put public sector accounts into the EduRoam service. So we're looking at rolling out a PSN Roam instead. Kent was one of the pilot areas for PSN Roam, working closely with the Cabinet Office. Things looked very promising. It was gathering lots of interest, lots of momentum. We had a couple of meetings up in London, and then the Cabinet Office suddenly pulled the plug and said, actually, we've had a better idea. We're not going to do this. We're going to procure a commercial company to hand out wireless security credentials and those kinds of things. So we then had our head in our hands, but what's actually happened is PSN Rome has gathered a momentum of its own in Kent, and there are now something like 7 partners, I think, at the latest count, with PSN Rome up and running. And Kent has been approached by all kinds of people from across the country saying, actually, we're very interested in this initiative, and could we talk to you about how we go about adopting it? One of the things we're trying to get in place is that anywhere that offers the PSN Rome SSID will also offer EduRome. And as a reciprocal arrangement to that, we're also looking at places offering EduRome also offering the PSN Rome SSID. Now, I know there are issues in offering additional SSIDs in terms of wireless network performance, but we still feel that really the gains there outweigh the costs. And in particular, for things like trainee medical students, medical professionals at some of the universities, trainee nurses, etc., there'll be enormous benefits if they can use EduRome at a local hospital. Conscious of time, and I do need to move on. Complexities in the security model are around the shades of trust. So you think, well, maybe we put a big firewall between the internet and all the schools. But actually that gives you a problem in that if a school catches a virus, then it'll infect all the other schools. So we've had to put some level of firewalling around the schools. And the more you think about this, the more actually it's shades of grey in the level of access, the level of security around the different public sector bodies. So there's an awful lot of sharing among district councils, and really you don't want them all firewalled off from each other in the traditional way in the black and white of the inside the firewall or outside the firewall. So we've had some interesting discussions about that, interesting discussions about the security topology, and some ideas flying around. So one idea is, for example, for local government sites, one of them had the statistic that I think around 99.6% of their email came from UK addresses. So why not use that fact and potentially grey list anything outside the UK so that gets treated slightly differently because a very high percentage of the spam comes from outside the UK. So lots of thoughts there about, well, what are the different levels of trust that you put in different organisations, and looking at how far you go outside your own network. Again, just some other areas to think about, and conscious of time, I won't go through these in detail, but another thing we're seeing increasingly is within our own campuses and within our own walls, we have really separate organisations working within the campus. Again, lots of questions about how you handle that, and KPSN's been involved in some of those discussions. So security, I mentioned, is based around central high-end resilient firewalls that are virtualized. This is the picture that I won't go through in a lot of detail in the interest of time. Layers 8 and 9, very briefly. Frankly, it involves an awful lot of time and effort and meetings, but we do tend to think that the outcome and the cost savings and the capability that it's given us in terms of the ability to share services more than outweighs the effort. So just some closing thoughts. As you're thinking potentially about your next procurement or about deploying software-defined networking, do have a think about these levels of trust, these shades of grey. It's not black and white anymore. So put some thought into this, and with luck you'll build a somewhat better topology for security than you would have done otherwise. So thank you, and we've probably got about 1 or 2 minutes for questions. You've let me off the hook as well.